Welcome to the panel on grief, ritual, creativity and the climate crisis, which follows the Vigil for the Smooth Handfish. My name is Fleur Ramsay and I'm a proud Samoan and an Indigenous rights and environmental lawyer practicing predominantly in the Pacific region. As I'm living on stolen lands in the colonial fiction of Australia, I'll start with an acknowledgement of country, which is a really important protocol that we do in Australia to acknowledge that we're on stolen lands and to acknowledge the peoples of the lands that we're living on. So I'm currently living on the lands of Biapai peoples, which the British colonisers called Port Macquarie. It's on the east coast of Australia. These are unceded lands over which the Biapai are sovereign. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I pay my respects to all First Peoples across this continent and to the First Peoples around the world. So I want to start by saying that I spent my Sunday afternoon, which is yesterday, watching the Vigil for the Smooth Handfish, a weirdly looking but compelling fish that I now feel involved with and intimately connected to. I was trying to think of ways I could describe the rainbow of emotions I felt watching it. Firstly, I felt grateful for the time and the creativity of each of the contributors and their reflections. I felt moved and I felt more than sad. I guess I felt a combination of those two things. And what the Vigil reminded me of actually is how Samoans manage death and dying. When a Samoan is dying, we sit in vigil with them. We'll stay at the hospital. It's very organised. People will bring food to support us when we're sitting in vigil. And then when the person that we're helping through that process of dying, we then sit in vigil with the dead body in our house for sometimes up to a couple of weeks. And the really interesting thing about that is it's part celebration, but it's also a collective grief process, and you never feel alone in that process. And I think that was what I felt when I was watching the Vigil. I thought it was a really kind of creative and important way for us to face the crises that we're facing collectively. And even though you feel the grief, you know, I certainly felt it for the Smooth Handfish. I felt that I wasn't alone in that, and I think that's something that we really need to take into in dealing with this crisis. Before I move on to introduce the panelists, I wanted to just say that the proceeds are going to the Pacific Climate Warriors. Now, the Pacific Climate Warriors, I'm not sure, I know there's a lot of audience from the Northern Hemisphere. You should know about them. They've been around for the last 30 years, and they've been advocating for frontline communities who will face the devastating impacts of climate change. And many of those frontline communities are in the Pacific region where I work. And they're really incredible in the way that they protest and advocate, because they use what is important to us traditionally, which is spoken word, storytelling, dance, and talanoa, which is meeting in person and online dialogue. And it's innovative and it's incredible. And so I just kind of urge you to go and do some research on them and to donate to them. They've been the leaders of climate advocacy, and I think we owe a massive debt to them, because if it wasn't for the Pacific, we wouldn't be talking about 1.5, and we know that 1.5 is what we need to stay alive. So I think that's really important, and that's where the money is going to. So I'm going to introduce the panelists. Unfortunately, there's been some last minute changes, and Vivien Sansour is no longer able to join us. I should preface that it's 7:30 a.m. where Daz and I am, and Chris Bonney, and Chris hasn't arrived yet, but we're hoping he will turn up at some point. So when he does, and if he does, I'll introduce him properly then. But we've got a really great opportunity for a conversation between Camille Barton, Daz and I, So I'm going to introduce you to Camille Barton, who is an artist, grief worker, and somatic educator, working on the intersections of wellness, drug policy, and healing justice. Camille is the director of the Collective Liberation Project and the creator of a trauma-informed approach to diversity and decolonization work that centers the body and lived experience. Camille is currently researching grief on behalf of Global Environmentalist Network, creating a toolkit of grief practices aimed at supporting intersectional approaches to ecological activism. They also work as a consultant for the Edge Funders Alliance and MAPS, ensuring that MDMA psychotherapy will be accessible to people of colour. Welcome, Camille. And Daz is the Vigil for the Smooth Fish Artistic Director and Advocacy Filmmaker and Media Worker. Daz is a creative producer and interdisciplinary storyteller, creating works using film, words, sounds, performance, emergent technologies, immersive experiences, and interactive platforms. Passionate about human rights, cultural democracy, and access, she has helped found creative media and radio programs with refugee communities in occupied Palestine, and has produced several screen-based advocacy works that have been exhibited internationally. At present, Daz's main interests lie in challenging socio-cultural and political ideas and using imagination or allegory to identify points of engagement between unlikely parties. They received the 2019 Graham F. Smith Peace Award for Innovation in Creative and Rights-Based Storytelling for the Parallel Effect. The Parallel Effect is an ever-expanding collective that uses creative interventions to respond to political and environmental crisis of today by reimagining alternatives to the present that we are living. Great. So just to say, in terms of format, please send through any questions that you have. We're not going to have the traditional question and answer at the end. It's just going to be a discussion for the next 45 minutes. And if you send through questions, I can moderate them and I'll ask those questions of the panel. You can just specify whether it's for an individual person or whether it's for the panel in general. So I think I might start with a question that interests me when I was watching the Vigil yesterday, and that is what motivated you to be involved in the Vigil? And I'll start with you, Camille, and then I'll move on to you, Daz.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Just to let you all know, if you're watching, I have a little bit of a cold, so if you hear my voice be funny, or if you're wondering why I look like a wrapped up snow person, that's why. In terms of getting involved in the Vigil, I think, yeah, I'm very interested in grief at the moment, and I've been researching different embodied approaches to grief for the last sort of 18 months, just completing this cycle now, this work again. And I think it was during that time that Daz reached out about the Vigil, and it felt like a really lovely way to contribute to a collective piece of grief work that also could have its own life and really reach people in many different parts of the world. And I'm quite curious about how we collectivize grief, because it's something that's, I think, under kind of late stage capitalism has become very individualized, where we're meant to kind of just be with it on our own, you know, close the door, or if we have the finances, then we go and seek a therapist, but we're not really encouraged to be together in that process. So yeah, I was really intrigued and appreciative of the opportunity to kind of contribute to something creative that would allow for that kind of connection. So that's what drew me in. Yeah.
And before I move to Daz, because you raised the question of grief, I think I have a very ambivalent relationship to grief as something which is a good emotion to have now. And I think actually you just hit the nail on the head in terms of talking about late stage capitalism and how individualized these affective and emotional processes have become. And so I guess the question then I would ask for you, because I know, by watching your incredible contribution and then also doing some research on your work to facilitate this panel, I can see that grief is a really important part of your practice. And I guess one of the questions that because you've prompted this, is how can grief be political useful for us in this crisis? It's a tough question.
It is a big question. I'm going to start off by saying I do not necessarily have the answer, but from my perspective, I think what I see is a toxicity in a lot of the ways we live in the West, and the way this kind of Western culture is globalized and around the world more and more, is this real disconnection from mind and body, this disconnection between our feelings and our actions. And to me, grief work is one way of being able to really sit with and acknowledge what's happening and the pain of what's taking place. When actually, sorry, excuse me, I think the production focus world we're living in doesn't really give us much space and time to be with that. So I think, as counterintuitive as it can seem, when there's so much urgency to fix everything and we have to do this and this and that, if we're not even feeling, how are we going to know how to make changes that don't just reproduce the same logic that we're coming from? Yeah. So I think there is a need to really be with the grief, feel into it, and try and make decisions that allow us to respond rather than react to it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that resonated also a lot in terms of when you were talking about the violence of the void and sitting with that, with the nothingness in a sense, but that the space of where feeling arises. But I think that's a really important point, because there's so many kind of imperatives around work and imperatives around all those kind of things in capitalism that we actually have very little time. And we have very little time for the crisis, but we have very little time even to work out how we're feeling or where we position ourselves. Daz, I'm going to throw back to you. And I guess I'll ask you not only what motivated you, but, we did also speak about earlier when we first started to talk about the journey to this vigil for you, and how you were saying that environmental issues didn't resonate with you at first at all, that you felt really disconnected from thinking about where the environment fitted in your life and your thinking and your feelings. And so I guess I'm going to ask you, what motivated you to put this together, and also to speak a little bit about that journey towards change. And what has changed for you through this entire process? Oh, you're on mute. Daz, you're on mute.
Oh dear. 7:30 in the morning, one coffee. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm joining you today from Awabakal country. It's also known by its colonised name of Newcastle, Australia. And I'd like to just start by saying what a tremendous privilege it is to be in this space with you, Fleur and Camille, today. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I respect you and your work so much. In terms of what motivated me to be involved in the vigil and to put it together, I guess it's twofold. I'd say that my principal motivation came from the fact that I personally feel that there's a kind of splintering happening, that the environmental movement and many other progressive movements have started to become compartmentalized and fractious. But I also feel more broadly that those who act to serve our environment are often reductively looped together in a minimizing way. And I feel that a lot of this has to do with the language that's purposely used around it, how it's framed. The climate crisis that we're facing, it's often framed as governments and corporations versus environmentalists, when realistically it should be something more along the lines of governments and corporations versus every other life form on the planet. You know, it's a crisis that clearly belongs to everyone, and it's a contract that we all share, and there's an entire planet at stake. So I wanted to invite as many people as possible into this vigil. And I think this work for our climate deserves and demands as many voices, as many disciplines, practices, and modes of feeling as possible, so that we can attempt to reach and recruit as many people and communities and resonate with those people and communities. Secondly, to get to your other point, it's true. I'm a product of a culture that has prioritized convenience over sustainability. It's prioritized capitalism and efficiency over beauty and appreciation. And this has meant that not only is a sense of our interconnectedness to our biosphere abstract, but it also has meant that spaces for rituals where we can grieve collectively for the profound losses are difficult to come by for many of us. So I kind of wanted to offer a receptacle of sorts where we can share our grief, but also our appreciation for what we've lost and the beauty that still is. So yeah, I think they're the two prime motivators for me.
Yeah, and I have to say, watching it, because, you know, I didn't know the Smooth Handfish, and I have to say I became pretty obsessively compelled by the handfish, and actually more interested in the other species of handfish and the struggles that they're going through. And I do think, like, at least for me, ritual is a really important process, but it made me think actually about one of the really important messages of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, around what's grievable life and what isn't grievable life. And that's a very political question. And so I guess what I'm wanting to ask you both is, do you think these kind of vigils can ritualize grief in a way so that we can start to see species as grievable? Camille, I'll open to you first.
Yeah, I think so. I think, as Daz was saying before, that I think there's a lot of people that maybe aren't immediately drawn into social movements because they aren't necessarily always very warm and fluffy and inviting. I say this having been involved in many activist movements for the last nearly 20 years. So there's a lot of reasons why people might be a bit, but if you do provide an opening to really be in the emotions together, to really acknowledge, not be told you should feel this way, but to be given the opportunity to feel and actually connect to what's moving in you, then I think there's a real power there. And I think that tying it to what you were saying about BLM and the ways that the movement for Black Lives has really started to use kind of vigils and certain collective grief practices and organizing, I think connects to a very old tradition of being able to come together and build capacity to change conditions, and to do this in the context of grief. There's actually a book that comes to mind called the author is Cindy Milstein, and it's called, no, I'm going to have to look it up in a moment, but it's about grief and social movements, basically, and how important this can be for connecting people and for allowing there to be an understanding of what emotions lie beneath the grief, which can be things like anger, desire for change, maybe it's like apathy, and to really create a container where people can be with all of that, and that can become really fertile generative space to take further action. So yeah, I think there is some awareness of this given the heavy-handedness many of these peaceful vigils have been met with, at least in the movement for Black Lives, because I think there's an awareness from the state that there is a power in collective grief and ritual. So yeah, I think it is something that I hope we see more of.
I just want to pick up on something that you said there, because I think at least a lot of the discussions I've seen around grieving and climate change, and the way that a lot of my friends think about it, is that it's almost an endpoint. It's almost a resignation that things aren't going to change, and so that we just have to learn how to manage our grief. So one, I'm interested in your views on that, and then the other thing I'm interested in is what other kind of actually, you said something really interesting about when you start to listen to that grief, then you might start to hear other things, which is a motivation for change and movement and action. And I just wanted to know whether you could reflect on that a little bit more, and how grief could potentially lead to political action and change.
Sure. I think that I'll bring it back again to feeling, because I know that for myself, a lot of the activist spaces I was involved in for a long time were maybe similar to what you were speaking about, Fleur, with your friends who say there's no time for this, in order to stay in the fight, we have to just do the logistical things we do now, and then when the revolution comes, then we can grieve, or then we can celebrate. And so I was very much kind of within this logic for a long time, and when I would question it, or pose the idea if we could have some prefigurative politics, maybe, which for those who don't know is the idea of trying to live the principles and values that you're trying to build towards, but really to create those in the moment. People would say, oh no, you're naive, we don't have time. And I would see that in many of these spaces, people were abusing substances. I had substance use things myself as a teenager for many years, because there wasn't any attention to grief and to the suffering or the trauma that we were experiencing, being kettled, getting into all these situations with protests. And it just became clear to me after time, this isn't sustainable. So I actually had a big break away from a lot of those spaces and moved towards organizing that was bringing in the body a lot more. It was rooted in somatics, that had a kind of both and approach. Not to say that, yeah, we just do our grief ritual and that's that. But understanding that we need to bring in the body, tend to our emotions, that's actually a huge part of the process, because it's what makes it sustainable. And in many of those spaces I was in before, they weren't sustainable. People were burning out or having various issues with addiction, because they weren't giving themselves permission to feel, to like be a human being in these spaces. And I ultimately decided that I wasn't going to wait for the revolution to come to be well, to enjoy my life, or to feel my feelings. And so that's completely changed the way that I do activism. And I'm still piecing together what it looks like for me, actually, and who I want to organize with. And also it's expanded my view of what activism is, because in some ways I've kind of disidentified. If people call me an activist, I'm not going to say, oh, I'm not, but I don't personally identify as one anymore, because I see the power that care work has, and that, parents or carers are doing, that various people are doing in society who activists might not say, they're doing the work. I think we all have our part to play, and I'm interested in how we can build coalitions and really do that with as much pleasure and care as possible.
Great, thank you. Daz, just to throw back to you in terms of the vigil as the opportunity to grieve co-species, and I guess I'm really interested in how the idea of the vigil itself came about.
Yeah, well, it's actually really interesting, just picking up on something Camille said just then. I think there are so many different modes of activism, and I've been on a similar journey with my own activism. In fact, I've always sort of struggled with the term activist. Not that I think there's anything remotely shameful in that terminology, but I feel like, once again, you know, English being my mother tongue and the limited sort of language and vernacular that we have to play with in the English language to some extent when it comes to, as we were speaking about yesterday, Fleur, like some of these huge experiences of crisis and crises that we're all living through at the moment. There isn't a word that actually sums up that feeling of ecocide, of genocide, of you know, powerlessness and sadness, but also will and beauty and appreciation, you know. So we're kind of limited with that particular toolkit of words. And I think there needs to be other ways. And for some people, it is sort of congregating with placards and moving through the streets. And for others, you know, it's meeting on a Friday after prayers at the mosque and, you know, throwing stones at bulletproof towers and going through that ritual as an act of solidarity against the ongoing occupation of their country. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with any of these forms. I think there's definitely a place for all of them. But I also think, with that in mind, in terms of creative considerations, because I am a creative worker, I'm aware of the fact that many people are living with a lot of anxiety right now around all of the many crises that are going on in stereo. And so I'm also very mindful, particularly with all of the wonderful people that are coming on board this ever expanding project, the Parallel Effect. I'm very mindful that we kind of want to try and produce work that combats climate fatalism and despair. I mean, acknowledging it, absolutely, acknowledging the crisis, absolutely, acknowledging our losses, absolutely. But at the same time, I think there is a desire underpinning our creative approaches to empower individuals and communities to take action. And I think beauty and imagination play a massive role in that. And I think stillness, and as Camille said, embodiment takes a massive role in that. And in terms of my personal journey and my pathway from social justice and human rights activism into sort of actually finally, and I'm quite, you know, embarrassed by this, but kind of it did take me a while, as I said, Fleur, to join the dots and sort of realize, you know, the interrelatedness of the climate crisis to social justice, to human rights, that it's actually, you know, the mother of everything, and to sort of, you know, shift and pivot and really understand and appreciate it in a way that I hadn't before. And then when it all sort of started to make sense and fall into place for me, I really wanted to champion, you know, the inspirational stories and actors from our diverse pasts that demonstrate an ability to act. And I think that's part of the reason why in the work that I curate or create myself, I always try and bring in so many different people and perspectives, because everyone has so much to offer. And it's, as I've said before, it is a shared contract. This is something that we are all a part of it, a part of the climate crisis, and we all need to work together as much as possible.
Great. I think I'm going to pick you up on the language issue in English in particular, because I actually think that English is, because it's a colonial language. So nature is an imperial term, and it's meant to be able to be taken to other countries and just apply to the landscape. And we know from Indigenous peoples, including, you know, Samoans are similar, they have a poetic involvement in that space. And so that in that land, they know it in a depth that English just can't capture, because because it is a colonial language. And so I think, you know, just even the concept of nature, it makes it extremely hard for people who are just raised within that kind of language paradigm to get to that particular understanding. And this is where I think, you know, Daz, you put in an interesting question in here about whether artistic tributes are fatuous in the face of an urgent crisis. But I feel that's not the question that we should be starting with, because coming from, you know, Samoan, which is a poetic tradition, we're a storytelling tradition, that I'm already there in terms of the way that storytelling can cut through. And so when you listen to Pacific leaders using English, they use it in a poetic way, which makes people resonate with the climate crisis. And so I think that, you know, storytelling has a really, really important function in terms of communicating. But then I guess, again, the question for me is that how can art motivate us to act? So there's an understanding, and I think people are starting to kind of understand what's happening. And there were so many incredible kind of questions around the smooth handfish, like what is it going to take to survive, and recognizing that it's an extinction crisis, recognizing that people are doing it, that it's not just, you talk about the social contract as if, you know, we're all in it together, but we also have to recognize that people are actively pursuing, and this is what someone said, actively pursuing genocide and ecocide, and we have to think about death in two ways. Intentional, the kind of death that's coming from this crisis, which is human-made and specifically made by a small class of people on the planet. So, yeah, the question for me, I think, needs to be now is what is it going to take for us to take that next step in terms of stopping this planetary crisis. So I'm going to start with you, Camille. And again, I'm sorry, this is a massive question, and I'm not expecting anyone to have the answer. But you know, we're all thinking these things. We're thinking these things. We're in the space. So wherever you're at with that thinking process, I'm sure the audience would love to hear
it. Thank you. That's a juicy question for sure. I think we need a diversity of tactics. I think one of the things I also noticed from colonial legacies of colonization is there's a lot of binaries, like has to be this or that. And we have to have just this one option. And I know in many traditional Indigenous cultures, there can be more than one thing can exist at the same time. And I think that's what I really ascribe to in this moment. With many challenges we face, I don't think there's just going to be one solution. I think we're really going to need to build coalitions, working at different angles of it, or touching different parts of the elephant, if you will, in order to really, create cracks in the system and to also be growing new possibilities, new pathways. And I do think there needs to be policy change, but at least in this stage of my life, that's not my personal main focus. I'm interested in what will happen if people are feeling more and able to actually be with the reality of what's happening, because I don't know about you, but it's quite challenging for me to actually fully feel the depths of my climate anxiety. I can't do it every day. I might have glimpses into it, but it's not something I'm actually with most of the day, because I can't function and engage in capitalism if I was. And so I think the embodiment work to me is about how do we titrate and be able to kind of be with it more, not be so dissociated because we're just functioning, but actually be able to kind of move in and out and use that information to kind of make decisions with. So I think there's a role for embodiment, a role for policy, a big need for people to really learn from and start respecting Indigenous leaders who are doing work on this issue and understand an actual alternative. I don't even want to say as an alternative, just ways to live in right relationship with the earth. It always frustrates me when you know, you have this kind of rising eco-fascist narrative of humans are the problem, we're the cause. It's like there are human beings alive right now who are protecting the most biodiverse parts of the planet. And you're literally, I mean, it's just such a Eurocentric view. So I think there's a need for that. But then also I think the role of art is incredibly important in actually illuminating these things and sharing these stories, because some people, you know, are book nerds like myself, but not everyone wants to engage with books. Not everyone's going to read nonfiction for fun, and that's completely fine. So I think we need film, we need theatre, we need storytelling, we need ways to make this playful and symbolically rich, so that it can be transmitted intergenerationally, cross-culturally, and that people can have a stake in actually engaging and creating change, even if it's in small fractal ways or really big ways. But as Daz was saying, for everyone to feel like they're part of it. So yeah, I think we need a lot of different facets. And I am personally, as a pleasure activist, of the belief that if we're in alignment with what we're most excited about, that's probably where our gifts are going to be most of service in each moment. So that's why for me, I'm on the kind of embodiment tip right now. But
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, you know, I'm not sure if a lot of the audience knows. I mean, you know, I kind of live and breathe Indigenous rights because that's my work. And so we know that 80% of the world's biodiversity is on Indigenous lands, and Indigenous people are 5% of the population. So even if you just support Indigenous people, you're fighting for the planet. And unfortunately, the question I would have put to Vivien and Chris is about, you know, their views on colonization and how colonization is an ongoing process and in what way it contributes to the current kind of climate crisis that we're in now. I do think that there was, you know, the decolonization process was very kind of, well, there's two aspects to it. People actually fought to get rid of the colonizers, and then there's a technical aspect of it where people ended up leaving or they got pushed out. But there's been no real discussion or reparations. There's been no kind of reckoning by Europeans of their violence. And for me, that's a missing piece in what's happening with the climate crisis, because for me, it's a continuation from 1492 when Christopher Columbus went to the Americas to now. It may be manifesting differently, but I think that's what's continuing to happen. And then, of course, Daz, in the beginning of the vigil, you kind of mentioned the billionaires, and you've got all this kind of space imagery of the billionaires who are wanting to leave the planet. And, you know, I kind of often imagine myself stowing away and then warning anyone, any planet they go to, just get rid of them straight away, because this is going to be an awful colonial process. But it just shows you how much we haven't learned. And I say we, I shouldn't say we, because I think, Camille, you made an extremely important point that there's no equality in these things. Like, certain people are acting in the Pacific. I always point out, you know, I hear all the time, we're all contributing to the crisis. I'm like, actually, Pacific people are negligible. They don't have any coal-fired stations, and historically and currently it's negligible. But actually, I'm really interested, Daz, in that beginning part of the vigil and your thinking in terms of making all of these connections in relation to space and how you made those connections, and just, yeah, more reflections on that, please.
Well, I suppose this, and bear with me, I don't know, this will be a stream of consciousness answer, I think. But yeah, the parallel effect, the whole thinking behind it is that basically, using the world of quantum mechanics, we're basically suggesting through this concept that at different points in our histories, pathways splintered off and all different possibilities emerged. And some of those possibilities might be utopian for me, they might be the worst dystopian image for another person, you know, but there are all different possibilities. And the thing is, all of these possibilities actually could happen or could be happening in parallel right now. And for some people are, you know, because as you said, Camille, I'm also really not a fan of the binary at all. And I find the binary extraordinarily reductive and limiting. And I feel like it actually just forces people to not think about things, because when you're thinking, there's always nuance. And I'm seeing this a lot in activist circles at the moment, and I feel like it's really limiting discourse, but also limiting the invitations to other people to join, as you said before, where they're not always warm and fluffy spaces. So going back to the space imagery and the role of the parallel present, you know, there's a lot of futuring projects at the moment that imagine the future in different ways. But the crisis or the crises are now. So I and everyone who's been working with the parallel effect, and if anyone's listening and would like to be involved, it's about, you know, it's about collaboration. And, you know, we want to collaborate with as many communities and people as possible. But it is about basically imagining the parallel present. You know, what does that look like? Where at previous moments in our histories could have things stemmed in different directions, pivoted elsewhere, and what would that present look like? And in that way, we can also champion sustainable knowledge and actually, you know, cite our predecessors, cite the, you know, extraordinary wisdom of Aboriginal, Indigenous communities from all over the world. The longest continuing culture is here on the stolen land, which I am now a settler. And, you know, yet we don't turn. And when I say we, you know, the people that are making policy do not turn to the elders of these communities and ask for help, you know, and say, what are we doing wrong? How can we fix this, when these people have the knowledge and the wisdom? And yet those same people, the Indigenous communities and the Pacific island nations who are on the front lines, are the people contributing the least when it comes to carbon emissions and fossil fuels. So yeah, there's so many injustices. And once again, because of, you know, the mega rich creating their bunkers and pouring their money into yet again the colonization of another planet, you know, it's just mind-boggling how crazy all of this is. So as I said, stream of consciousness answer, I really don't know if there were any sensible nuggets in there, but I suppose that's where the space imagery came into play.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when I was thinking about parallel universes, I liked that you were talking about, you know, they could be utopian, they could be now. I think that concept of a parallel present is really important, particularly from an Indigenous perspective again. You know, I kind of, you probably would have heard Zizek say, it's quite a famous saying, I think he got it from someone else, you know, we can imagine the end of the world, but we can't imagine the end of capitalism. And I'm like, you don't have to imagine it. There's actually so many communities that have been living kind of anti-capitalist and non-capitalist lifestyles, which is connected and rooted in relationality and connected in land. And I know, Camille, I really liked how you were talking about that disconnection. I mean, I don't like it, but I think it's really important that one, we recognise that I think a lot of people are disconnected from relating to the natural world and even ourselves within that. But also and this is, something I just offer as a comment for the people who are watching, there's Indigenous people doing incredible scholarship at the moment around relationality as a methodology. So our life worlds are based in relational approaches. And so we even consider, parts of the natural world kin. We're related to them. And we're talking about how that can be used also by others. So there's kind of prospects there, and that's an imagining a future. And for us, the future is in the past. That's Indigenous futurism. And I noticed, Camille, that you've got some interest in Afrofuturism. I know this is didn't prepare you for this question, but I'm just interested in your kind of reflections on Afrofuturism in terms of a potential ecological practice, or what it is to you, or what you're currently engaging with in relation to Afrofuturism.
Thank you for the question. Also, I'd love to learn more about this scholarship you're speaking on about relationality. It sounds super up my street. Yeah, really important. I think similarly for me, my mother is Yoruba and Guyanese, my dad's Celtic. And I feel quite connected to my Yoruba ancestry. It's only a few generations away since they were colonized. My mom was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and there's a lot of that I feel in my body and legacies in my family line. But I also know that having been born and raised in the UK, I'm also socialized in the colonizer mentality. It's the only language I speak. It's very much just what's in me. And so I'm curious about what it looks like to, as my friend Nema Guterre would say, to kind of re-indigenize. And this can be a controversial topic for some people, and I think it sometimes can make me, go a little bit, get uncomfortable depending on how people use it. But when I'm talking about it, I'm really thinking about what it looks like to reconnect that circle of ways of knowing and relationality, which was for many of my ancestors a way of being that's not so far back, but given my socialization and assimilation into Western culture is a bit of a bridge that needs to be crossed. And I understand that it's not possible for me to just go completely back in time. Many of the practices and stuff have been eradicated. There's still a lot there, but there's a lot that's gone. And so I feel like Afrofuturism is a really beautiful practice to build upon what is still there and what can be remembered, but to put it into present and into future time, and think about what it would look like to contextualize this and allow pathways towards that relationality. So that's kind of the importance it has for me. It feels like a pathway to kind of reconnect to what I've been forcibly disconnected from. And it's also just a beautiful way for me to expand my imagination and what seems possible in this kind of Western capitalist frame, and actually all the other possibilities and parallel different interdimensional potentials there are even within this lifetime. So yeah.
I mean, look, I think it's really important for us to be future thinking, because we're very good at diagnosing the crisis, and I think working out ways that we can live, or what I know alternatives, and I suppose that's a contested term in itself, but just vision making and futurity is really important. And one of the things that I really want to ensure is that Indigenous people are part of that discussion, because often we get kind of sidelined, erased. Even our kind of advocacy, like I'm sure actually a lot of people don't know about the Pacific Climate Warriors, but really, like, they've been incredible. And also, I think, just picking you up on pleasure activism, the Warriors put on, I will always remember this protest, because it was a protest, but they put on this protest in Newcastle where they built traditional canoes from 15 different islands in the Pacific, and they brought them over to Newcastle, which is a coal port in Australia. And a lot of people came in solidarity and went out with them on kayaks. And so you had this incredible kind of ritual. Again, we come back to ritual where people were traditionally dancing. There was a lot of singing, and then everyone was dressed in, like, you know, the Pacific warriors were dressed in traditional attire, and they went out into the bay and they tried to block a coal ship. And it was interesting from the perspective that the police didn't quite know how to deal with it. I mean, you know, the police did actually end up being what they end up doing, which is quite violent, but it was this incredible spectacle. And then the other part was that they had a reggae band. So the warriors brought a reggae band on the beach who was singing Bob Marley while the canoes and everyone were fighting with the police. And my friend turned to me and he goes, I don't know whether I'm at a protest or a party. And you know, I feel like in terms of what you were saying, both of you, Daz and Camille, in terms of bringing people in, Daz and I were talking about like the seriousness of the issue, but actually having to remember our kind of humanity and the love of joy and dance and festivity. And, you know, I'm also I'm queer, and I think queers are particularly good at combining protest, politics, joy, sexuality as well. So I just I wanted to kind of say that. And then I'm interested to know, because we've only got 5 minutes left, Daz, what particularly resonated with you in the Vigil? I know it's really hard to kind of isolate, you could say more than one, but what really spoke to you and why?
This was the question that I was hoping you weren't going to ask me, because honestly, as someone who, you know, curated this and was so fortunate to get so many amazing respondents and contributions that to me, like a biosphere, are all part of, you know, they are an ecosystem. Like I feel like each contribution speaks to another contribution, and that was done with quite a lot of care. I always well up when I see Kabir McConnell's contribution, which is right at the start. Kabir is one of the co-founders of Art Lords, which is an amazing group of activists in Kabul, Afghanistan. And when Kabir articulates the relationship between time and grief, and basically really sort of underlines the fact that grief is not an egalitarian emotion because of the systems, the prevalent systems that we're living under today, that grief has become something that really, you know, isn't accessible in the same ways to all. And, you know, in Kabul, for someone like Kabir and for his community there, you know, where every moment is dotted in potential tragedy, but they have to get up in the morning and keep going, there isn't any time. There is no opportunity to actually process it and sit silently and hold those things. So every time I experience that particular tribute, I feel so many things. I don't even know where to begin. Yeah. But yes, I just think I've spoken too long. We're running out of time.
Yeah, we are. Well, there's actually one question I do want to quickly ask you, but I just wanted to say in terms of scale, people need to remember, like, we're all going to be affected, but people have been affected in different ways, you know, just dealing with life itself, you know, Black Lives Matter, just dealing with life, living the, you know, the right not to be killed in the Pacific waters, lapping at the doors now of people. And it's important not to have a victimhood in relation to the Pacific, but to deal with those realities and also see the way in which they're leaders. But I just wanted to end with this question, Daz, because I think it's a really good one. In relation to the first question, someone asked about land acknowledgement. I'm not going to ask that because it's very specific to Australia, and Chris isn't here, and I think that really should have been a question for him. But this is a great question, Daz. Why did you choose to hold the vigil for the smooth handfish as opposed to other extinct species? I feel so tender towards it after the vigil. I hope we can direct our collective attention to it before this ends. So why the smooth handfish?
I think for the main reason is I was sitting alone during lockdown in a tiny flat in the Kulin Nation, which is also known as Melbourne, and it was a really dreary time there. Our lockdown restrictions were really severe, and I was reading the Scientific American, and I read about the smooth handfish, and then I just went on a 2-hour sort of online discovery session where I learned more and more about its existence and how basically colonization ruined its journey here. And I just feel like that speaks to so much of the crises that we're dealing with right now. And I suppose that's why for me, it was the smooth handfish. It could have been so many other, you're absolutely right, plant or animals. But that was why it was the smooth handfish on this particular occasion. And I think it serves as a symbol for everything that we're losing, that we have lost. And an opportunity for us to think of the interconnectedness of all of the interrelated themes of those things.
Well, we've managed to do well in the hour, given that we lost 2 of our panelists. But I just wanted to thank Camille and Daz for a really great conversation. Thank you for everyone who has come to watch it. And I think the vigil was great. I can't wait to see what else you do, Daz and Camille. I looked at your website. I was really excited to see what you're doing. I'm going to be following very closely your work in relation to the Ecologies of Transformation course. So just go and have a look at Camille's website, because there's some really exciting things coming up, and good strategies also for dealing with this crisis. Great to talk to you, and thanks for coming.
Thanks, Fleur. Thank you, Daz.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thanks, Camille and Fleur. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.